Unfortunately, I think a lot of us, and I'm one of them, listened to the line in the 90s, depression is a neurotransmitter imbalance, or it's a serotonin deficiency. Neuroscience has never supported that. We don't even know that the reason why Prozac works is because it works on serotonin.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 211th episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to help the better workings of your own brain, which it is probably uncontroversial to say if your brain is frequently interrupted by intrusive, unpleasant, nasty, distracting, anxiety-inducing thoughts. You probably want to get rid of those by whatever means you've got available. Specifically, we're going to be talking in this episode about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's been known historically by other names, but that's what's in vogue these days. And a new study going on that's been looking at a potential therapy using MDMA. This has completed phase 2 FDA trials, is moving on to phase 3 now, but the preliminary results in the battle of MDMA versus PTSD have been quite positive, and in the upcoming interview, we're going to hear from one of the clinical researchers who's been involved with that trial, telling us all about what's happened to date, what's still to be discovered, and why there's some reason for optimism here. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, I'm going to tell you about a new study showing a little bit of the whys and hows of why certain people are more able to resist the detrimental effects of sleep deprivation. That'll be in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick, but right now let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So it is certainly not news that quitting smoking is a difficult thing. A lot of people try, a lot of people fail. Not trying to discourage anybody who's in the process of trying to quit, but most attempts to stop smoking are famously unsuccessful, even if people use methods like nicotine replacement therapy. But the actual neurological details as to why quitting is difficult have not always been clear, and a recent study by researchers at Penn State University have been trying to shed some light on that. And according to this research, it looks like people's ability to make value-based decisions, assigning proper motivational weight to the decisions that they're making, is actually adversely impacted by nicotine withdrawal. So if you are on nicotine withdrawal, you have a harder time assessing the value of continuing to maintain your nicotine abstinence. You might cognitively know, hey, this is important, but it might not feel as important as it normally would. Says Dr. Charles Geyer, one of the lead researchers in this study. We are particularly interested in smoking because nicotine has widespread effects on the brain, including effects on cognition and one's sensitivity to both drug and non-drug awards. Knowing more about how these processes interact is important to better understand the decisions that people make after exposure to nicotine, and thus this can help inform smoking cessation strategies. So in this study, they found 18 daily smokers, and they tested these people on 2 separate occasions. In one session, the participants were tested after smoking normally, and in another session, they were tested after going cold turkey off cigarettes for 12 hours. So not a huge amount of time, but definitely enough to let the withdrawal symptoms kick in. In either case, participants completed a working memory task on a computer where they were asked to focus on a fixation cross they were supposed to stare at, but also to be aware of a dot that would flash in their peripheral vision. Then after a short time, the cross would disappear and they would have to move their eyes to where they remembered the dot having been. And the researchers used eye tracking software to see both how quick and how accurate they were in moving their eyes to the right spot. Then to make this a little bit more interesting, they added monetary compensation for quickness and accuracy. So there's actually a small but meaningful cash award if people were particularly quick and accurate in moving their eyes to the right spot. And according to this study, the people who had smoked recently, who were not having nicotine withdrawals, they improved in their performance. They got better at this once there was a monetary reward involved. But the participants who were experiencing nicotine withdrawals, they didn't get any better when the monetary reward was offered. Says Geyer, our results indicate that during a state of nicotine deprivation, participants fail to receive the same reward-related boost to their working memory. We hope that these results shed light on how rewards affect cognitive systems such as working memory, which is critical for our understanding of motivated decision-making. So a pretty interesting feedback loop. People get worse at weighing the importance of the bad decision they might be on the precipice of making until they've already made the bad decision, and at that point it's too late.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Dolver22 from the USA says, I love that Smart Drug Smarts allows me to take a sneak peek into where science is headed and what practices might be on the horizon. It's like looking into the future. And listener Soren Kierkegaard, also from the USA, says, Supreme podcast, Jesse's diction and predilection for editing interviewees' speech into similar precision makes for easy listening. Actually, credit where credit is due on the editing. That goes to our show's editor, Anushtup. But thank you, Soren. Thank you, Dolver. And thanks to everybody that's been leaving iTunes reviews. Spray painting Smart Drug Smarts graffiti on the side of bridges, photobombing people taking selfies in a Smart Drug Smarts t-shirt, anything like that. Within reason, of course, is appreciated. Don't make a nuisance of yourself. By the way, on t-shirts, I offhandedly mentioned Smart Drug Smarts t-shirts several episodes ago. Somebody actually reached out to me who has a t-shirt shop. We might be seeing about getting some Smart Drug Smarts t-shirts done up. That would be a 2018 thing. I don't have details on that yet, but if you are the type of person who would wear a Smart Drug Smarts t-shirt and you're jumping up and down or salivating or both, drop me an email, let me know. As with all these things, public demand sort of influences where we put our attention. But one of these weeks, I assume I'll be making a Smart Drug Smarts t-shirt announcement. One place where we love to announce things is the Brain Breakfast newsletter. If you have not yet signed up for that, we would be happy to grace your email inbox if you give us permission. You can get signed up at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter and be sending you a holiday hello in a couple of days here. One thing going on for the holidays, I can say with assurance, is that there is a holiday sale going on over at axonlabs.io. Prices dropped for the end of the year on Nexus and Mitogen. Free shipping if you're within the United States. Nobody likes paying for shipping, but we'll eat your shipping costs along with our Christmas pudding for the next couple of days. So pay a holiday visit over at axonlabs.io. And Vitamonk.com, our other sponsor, I've got reason to believe is putting together something pretty cool for subscribers. This hasn't been announced yet, but is on the cusp of being announced. Probably will be by next week's episode. And if you sign up for the Brain Breakfast newsletter, I'll let you know about it there as well. But an excellent incentive coming up to find out about their deep bench of products. You can get on Vitamonk's launch list at smartdrugsmarts.com/launch, or you can get shopping immediately at vitamonk.com.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So if you've been listening to Smart Drug Smarts for a while, you might remember back to episode number 99 when I spoke with Brad Burge, who's part of the organization MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. And one of the things that they were working on, which is still underway, is studying the use of MDMA as a potential therapy along with psychological intervention for people suffering from PTSD. PTSD these days is infamous as something that warfighters, veterans sometimes come back with, but there's a lot of other ways to experience traumatic stress. We'll be hearing about the multiplicity of types of people that are affected by this, but MDMA is probably most famous as an ingredient and oftentimes confused with the street drugs ecstasy and Molly. It's not exactly the same thing, but you could be forgiven if you made that assumption. Technically, MDMA is called 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, and among its effects, it's known to increase feelings of empathy between people and also give users feelings of euphoria and heightened physical sensations on a trip that lasts between 3 and 6 hours. I think this study assumed an 8-hour time period of total effects. Currently, MDMA has no accepted medical uses by the US FDA, but due to the study that we're going to be hearing about, that may be changing relatively soon. MAP's stated goal for this study is to change the status of MDMA into an FDA-approved drug for PTSD. Human trials are obviously a big part of that. We'll be hearing about the first and second stage trials from our coming interview guest. Dr. Will VanDerveer is a psychiatrist involved in this study. He's been involved with MAPS for over 5 years now and is very interested, as you will hear, in the potential therapeutic uses of psychedelic compounds. He also has an overall interest in reforming psychiatry by helping other psychiatrists learn ways to heal people without overly medicating or anesthetizing them. If there's the two types of people, the one that gets into a cold swimming pool slowly and the other that cannonballs in, he seems like the psychiatric equivalent of somebody that favors the cannonball technique, sometimes favoring the extremely acute rather than the ongoing use of pharmaceuticals. But he's obviously working with people that have very serious issues that they're dealing with. And what's really interesting about the approach that MAPS is taking in these studies is the combination of those two tools, psychological and chemical, and how they might really be complementary. So let's move ahead talking MDMA versus PTSD with Dr. Will VanDerveer.
So it's always been an interest to me, the different ways that people can heal. And I went the traditional route. And as I was going through psychiatry training, I started to get disillusioned about the tools that I was learning. I was pretty excited about psychotherapy and the different styles and strategies and ways to get into the subconscious, hypnosis and all that kind of stuff. But then I found that the medications that I was learning how to prescribe were kind of inadequate for a lot of people and came with a lot of side effects, a lot of downsides. And so I started looking pretty early on for alternatives to that. So over the last 20 years or so, really found, I think, pretty good strategies and tools for working with people with minimal use of pharmaceuticals. So that's been a big part of my working my way through things. And part of that was, as a resident, I met a Buddhist teacher and started meditating and going on meditation retreats and got way into that world for about 10 years, very committed and meditating a lot, and started teaching people how to meditate in my clinical work. And for a while, I thought that was going to be the cat's meow, and that would take care of helping me to not use as many medications. But it turned out that that was one of many tools that I needed to help myself sort of get out of the conventional box and work with people, I needed to go further afield. So the work with MAPS and the research on PTSD with using MDMA psychotherapy to treat treatment-resistant PTSD has really opened my eyes to non-ordinary states of consciousness and the potential healing power of using an intervention that induces an altered state while you're working deeply with somebody in psychotherapy. And just seeing how fast that can accelerate the healing path has been really encouraging and frankly renewing in my vision of what psychiatry can be and what it can do for people.
There's so much more talk about PTSD now, I feel like the past 5 to 10 years than there used to be. Is there more PTSD in the world, or is it just something that we're more aware of, or some combination of both? Do you have any thoughts there?
Well, I think it's both. I think we are more aware. I think we have the adverse childhood event study that Vincent Folletti did in the 90s at Kaiser, and what came out of that, looking at chronic medical disease risk correlated with early childhood trauma. That's a huge contribution that was made that became sort of part of the working understanding, I think, part of the mainstream understanding of how medical disease emerges through inflammation, starting with early childhood trauma. And then, of course, we have the wars. When I talk with people on airplanes about my work, they immediately go to military trauma when I say PTSD, and which is valid. PTSD rates in veterans is at least double what it is in the civilian population. But most of the people I see, because I don't work in the VA system, I see tons of people with early childhood abuse and neglect and trauma and adversity. And my perspective on your question is really that we have overdiagnosed things like bipolar disorder and major depression when really there's a trauma history that hasn't been talked about or discovered or unearthed. And I find that people with so-called mood disorders or so-called anxiety disorders, if you can find the trauma and treat it, usually those symptoms will either go away or become workable enough that the person doesn't need to take medication anymore. That's kind of my soapbox, is that maybe it's not that PTSD is more common. Maybe it's that some of us are starting to see that a lot of the breadth of these diagnostic categories that we have in psychiatry are oftentimes at root have a trauma involved in the origin.
One of the things that it seems to me is sort of a difference in your approach is that a lot of mainstream psychiatry seems to be around ongoing use of medication that you take on an indefinite basis, whereas what you seem to be a proponent of is like very acute, short-term, and aggressive type of medication. You go in, you get the problem, you solve it, you never come back to that particular tool.
Right. That is the goal. And I think it's just born out of my couple decades experience of watching people not do well long-term on medication. I've got one person I'm working with right now whose parents I was talking to the other day, and they said, they just don't see the spark of life in her eyes anymore. It's because she was put on an antipsychotic in a program. And then I can sort of see when somebody's in my waiting room almost that they're on an antipsychotic drug before I even talk to them, because there's a certain dullness that oftentimes appears for people. And the sad thing is that a lot of people aren't even aware that they are having that dullness. And there's so much sensitivity around this stuff. It's very sad, that family members and friends are reluctant to give people that feedback if they see it, if they perceive it, because it's sensitive. But then you also have specific risks like diabetes and obesity and the propensity for people, for example, who take SSRIs long-term to end up having mood swings that now you've got a iatrogenic bipolar disorder from having taken an antidepressant for too many years. These are risks that physicians who prescribe these drugs don't talk to their patients about ahead of time. They don't talk about withdrawal syndromes and the difficulty of coming off of medication, that the suicidal ideation that led to the person getting on the med might actually be worse as they come off of the med later. So I guess my practice has become a little bit of a niche where people who really don't want to be on long-term medication but have serious problems, they just want to take a different path because they know about the risks. The good news is that there are a lot of other kinds of root causes there. We talked about adverse childhood events, and that's a big one in my practice, but there's also all kinds of gut imbalances. There are all kinds of inflammatory processes that can produce symptoms of depression or symptoms of mood swings or anxiety and insomnia and those kinds of things that when we can get to the root causes and we can address them, then the symptoms diminish or go away. So, as long as you're looking, you can generally find things that are treatable. It's an exciting and fun way to practice, and I can't sit here and tell you that, like you said earlier, I don't really have a standard of care to back me up in how I'm working with people, but there is a growing, I would say, groundswell of desire amongst people suffering and also amongst practitioners to apply functional medicine principles to psychiatry. And a couple of my friends and I created a training for docs and other prescribers and mental health professionals to learn how to do that, to rely minimally on pharmaceuticals and use these other tools and get at root causes and mitigate them.
How often is it that you come across someone that you're unable to treat effectively in this way, that they are unresponsive or that the effects don't last in the way that you'd like to see them last?
Well, that's a good question. It's tough to answer that because everybody is so different. Each person is, the challenges they face and the constellation of supports that they have in their lives is so unique. So I think it really depends on how severe the challenge and how intractable and long-term the challenges have been and what the resources are that the person can count on to get the job done. But I've worked with people with psychosis, with full-blown manic bipolar disorder. There are ways to address those kinds of symptoms and those kinds of presentations without medication as well. But if a person doesn't have a caring home environment or a caring family, or, if they're addicted to alcohol, their gut is a mess, then the process is going to be a lot slower. So I feel pretty confident that if I have enough time with a person and I can do the things that I am confident will help them, that I can get a lot done with them. And the other thing is really what their goals are. Not everybody wants to come off of medication, and I don't come with that agenda that everyone should come off of medication. But since so many people seem to want that, there's plenty of people for me to work with who are on that bandwagon.
Is that difficult sometimes, trying to get people on board with, they're coming to you to get off medication and you're, in some cases, might be proposing a medication switch? It might seem like more of what they're trying to get out of. Especially, it seems like in some cases, people are going to have problems just getting off the medication that they're on and might have their defense shields up against taking anything new.
In our MAP studies, we have to taper people off of everything in order to be able to participate in the study. And that's been interesting to sort of witness firsthand. And my observation as compared to my clinical practice, where if the person knows that they're going to be able to take a treatment like MDMA, then the ability to come off of medication is different than if it's sort of an open question about whether they're going to be okay or not off of medication. It's almost like, okay, I can look forward to something that I'm pretty confident is going to really reduce my symptoms. So there's a high degree of willingness to tolerate difficulty coming off medication. On the other hand, there are certain medications that psychiatrists prescribe a lot, like Paxil, for example, or Effexor is another one that can just have horrifying, or Abilify is another one, really bad withdrawal effects. So again, each person is different, but there are things that we can put in play to help people come off of medication more easily. For example, I've been using ketamine treatments to address the suicidality that can spark up when people are coming off of drugs, where the tapering process can make them more suicidal, and that's been a useful tool, kind of a safety net under the tightrope.
This is sort of an off-topic question, but that is so weird and terrible that there is something morphological in the brain that is like a suicide trigger, that you can biochemically tickle this thing that makes you want to consider taking your own life. It seems like if there were anything that evolution would not permit to remain part of our species, it would be something like that.
Right. Well, again, it's sort of like probably not one button for one person. I think there's so many different ways to understand what suicidality really is. I would say by and large, the majority of those situations that I see are cases where the suffering is so acute and so intense, the person just wants to get away from the suffering. And so if you can find another way to mitigate the suffering, then the suicidality, becomes a non-issue. It's not always the case, the way that that's presenting, but most of the time it's about, I can't tolerate this experience I'm having. Now, one caveat or another category that I see commonly is people who have just been suffering for so long that they're just at the end of the rope. They can't take it anymore. So it's not so much for them about the acuity of it as much as just, okay, I've put in a 20-year effort with treatment-resistant depression and I'm just done.
They can only fight the fight for so long.
Yeah.
So tell me about the work that you're doing now, the trial with using MDMA as a therapeutic intervention against PTSD, what the protocol's like there, how the trials are going.
The trials are going really well. We finished our phase 2 phase of the work, which led to a meeting in November of last year with FDA, the end of phase 2 meeting, where Michael Mithofer and Rick Doblin presented the data to FDA, and that resulted in approval of proceeding to phase 3. That was in November. And then in August of this year, the FDA gave the phase 3 protocol that we submitted to them breakthrough designation for MDMA psychotherapy for PTSD, which basically means that it's a way to streamline and facilitate and encourage treatments that have moved through phase 2 with powerful enough results and good enough safety profile that the FDA thinks, wow, this could be the next big thing for the treatment of this condition. So in phase 2, we had roughly 100, give or take, people, and we had a little over 2/3 of the people who came through protocol didn't meet criteria for PTSD anymore. And these are people who had very severe and very chronic symptoms of PTSD.
And are these PTSD patients all across the board as far as the specifics of what they're anxious about?
Yes, totally across the board, all different kinds of issues. In the study that I was involved in Boulder, we had 3 veterans. So it was mostly people who had early childhood abuse, neglect. There were a few people who came in with, okay, this is the one thing that happened to me that I'm here to treat. But in general, even with those folks, there were earlier experiences that sort of set them up to have a PTSD response to the thing that they sort of the index trauma or the thing that they believed was the reason they had PTSD.
Regardless of how successful the trials may be, if Big Pharma doesn't see a way of making money off this, I just wonder, is there institutional pushback behind the scenes? Here's the question. If MDMA turns out to be a great prescribable treatment for PTSD, does somebody own MDMA? Like, what does the legal jurisdiction look like for this drug now?
That's a good question. I think, first of all, for PTSD per se, the Big Pharma really only was able to get 2 drugs approved for the treatment of PTSD. So that's Zoloft and Paxil, and they're both off patent at this point. On a political side, I have a hard time seeing that there's a big vested interest against MDMA on that level.
It's not that they're losing money, they're just losing the opportunity to make money by coming up with something new.
That's true. I mean, I guess that would be a potential threat. But, in psychiatry, there's been a big drought of new drug development. It's kind of sad because, there are all these sort of Me Too drugs that have come out, but just not that much in terms of creative new approaches.
Is there a sense of why that is? Is R&D just getting too expensive? I mean, I find it hard to think that science is running dry of new ideas.
Well, my sense from the inside of conventional psychiatry is that we've really fallen down in terms of understanding what the mechanisms are of the diseases that we treat. I think in other specialties, you know a lot more about what you're dealing with and what the physiology really is, what the disease is. And so in psychiatry, unfortunately, I think a lot of us, and I'm one of them coming out of my training, listened to the line in the 90s, depression is a neurotransmitter imbalance, or it's a serotonin deficiency, or something like that. And, neuroscience has never supported that. We've never been able to test people for low serotonin and say, okay, well, here's your serotonin drug. We don't even know that the reason why Prozac works is because it works on serotonin. There are some people who think that SSRIs are working through an anti-inflammatory pathway, for example. Take bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, it's the same thing. We don't know what's going on. We say that in bipolar that people who have a lot of episodes of mania can develop this kindling effect, like people with epilepsy have kindling. In other words, they will have more and more episodes the more their disease goes on untreated. But we don't know what that's about. We don't know how that works. We don't know what mania is. We don't know what depression is. And it seems like for a while in psychiatry, it looked like, well, okay, we're going to do all this human genome mapping, and that's going to tell us all about psychiatric problems. And then we find out that hundreds of genes are involved in each of these diagnoses, right? But I think it starts with having a diagnostic manual that's phenomenological as opposed to ideological. So I think that's part of the problem in drug development is that it would be nice to know what you're trying to target if you're trying to develop a tool to target it.
It reminds me of the quest to solve Alzheimer's, and it just seems like this is such I think pleiotropic is the term there to use. There's maybe like a stew of 50 different things that are all involved. And if you get 40 of those things wrong, it doesn't matter which 40, you're probably going to get Alzheimer's. But if you keep it under 20, you're probably okay. The particular levers that you pull, it's like you can pull some levers, just don't pull too many of them. I kind of feel like most of the big problems that we have left are complex in that way. It's not a single point of failure.
Right. I agree with you. And I think in psychiatry, we have this huge component of unconscious beliefs and unconscious self-identifications and ideas about who we are, what's possible. And that's one of the things that I think is talk about levers that you can pull. I mean, as a clinician, that's all I'm looking for is where are the levers that I can pull. And what's so cool about the MDMA effect is that people can go in under the drug effect and they can find parts of themselves that they've had to disown or disavow in order to survive what they lived through. And they can collect these self parts and become integrated and whole again. I'm sure that there are physiologic correlates to that process, which hopefully eventually we could elucidate. But right now, for me, it appears to be much more of a psychological expedition. We know some of the things about the mechanism of MDMA that facilitate that, but we don't know a lot about the actual clinical, what is that neurophysiologic lever that's turning, that has somebody's amygdala downregulate permanently, or at least through the length of our long-term follow-up studies to this point.
This seems to be one of these therapies where you need to have the psychological guide in addition to the chemical key in the lock being there. But it would be really interesting to try to disentangle those two. Like, obviously, people have tried doing the therapy in the absence of the chemical. I wonder what the chemical would do in the absence of the therapist and seeing what that interplay is. I mean, on the other hand, it's tough to test that because each human being's situation is going to be different.
Well, we're going to take a stab at that question in phase 3 because FDA is having us do the protocol a little bit differently from what we did in phase 2. We're not going to be giving MDMA without therapy, but we are going to be giving people therapy without MDMA.
Is that blind or non-blind? Like, will the participant think that they're getting MDMA?
Yes, it's definitely going to be a blinded, randomized, fully up to FDA standards trial to try to answer the question. So the participants are going to be blinded, the therapists and physicians are going to be blinded, everybody's going to be blinded.
Will that be with an active placebo?
In phase 3, I've been told that it's not an active placebo. In phase 2, we did have a low-dose MDMA active placebo. So it is slightly different, and it'll definitely help us look at, okay, well, how much of the clinical benefit of this is the psychotherapy and how much of it is going to be attributable to the MDMA component of the psychotherapy. So in phase 2, we had a double-blinded randomized controlled trial for treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress. And the randomization, as we just talked about a moment ago, was to an active placebo, which was an initial dose of 40 milligrams of MDMA, followed by an optional booster dose 90 to 120 minutes later of 20 milligrams. So total was either 40 or 60 in the active comparator arm of the study. And then the people who were randomized to full dose MDMA would get either 100 milligrams or 125. And then there was one study where people also got 75, and then the booster dose was always half of what the initial dose was. So if it was 125, the booster was 62.5. If it was 100, then the booster was 50, and so on. And the way that the structure of the protocol worked was people who were randomized to the active placebo would have to go through 2 of those 8-hour sessions before the unblinding occurred. And then at that point, they were allowed to circle back around and have 3 full-dose MDMA sessions. The way it worked was people would either come in and get randomized to full dose and have a total of 3 full-dose MDMA sessions 1 month apart, each one of those being 8 hours. And then they would also have several sessions leading up to the first MDMA experience, and then several sessions before the second MDMA experience, and then several more before the third, and then several at the end. There was a total of more than 30 visits.
Were they starting after the person had completely washed out of whatever their earlier prescription medication had been? Or
Yes. Yeah. So they had to have several half-lives behind them of being free of the previous treatments that they were receiving.
Yeah, from an experimental ethics standpoint, it seems like if you're getting off of your existing medications and had to go through that withdrawal process, it would be very unfair for the people that were in the control group not to eventually get the active treatment.
Well, that's right. And our team felt like that was an ethical issue that really needed to be carefully considered, to have people who were oftentimes so close to suicide and so on the edge, to have them give up their supports, what little support that they did have, and then come away empty-handed, felt like that was really not an ethical thing to do. So I'm glad that it was set up that way.
Why do you think it is that altered states of consciousness, whether that's from MDMA or other means of getting outside of one's normal perceptual bubble, why do you think in general this is such a useful tool in the psychological, psychiatric tool belt?
But basically, my understanding is that this sense of self that we have, which is pretty rigid if we are suffering from depression or anxiety, kind of disorganizes under the influence of a psychedelic. And it also does the same thing with ketamine and MDMA, having similar disorganizing effects on the default mode network. So when the default mode network goes more disorganized, the sense of self becomes more fluid, and the sense of self and other becomes more open. And so new understandings are more available to be grasped or to be kind of installed in the memory banks or in the self-understanding. And so I think that that's one way that we get efficacy in an altered state that's difficult to get to in ordinary states of consciousness, because the ego is more heavily defended in ordinary consciousness states.
Right. It's like you've caught the security guard asleep.
Yeah, exactly. So you can go in behind the security guard and rearrange the furniture and then get out before the security guard wakes up. And then all of a sudden you put a cushion behind the security guard's back and he's like, oh, wow, this is cool. I can be more relaxed,
If somebody that's having serious psychological issues like PTSD can get benefits out of a therapy like this, they've got, for lack of a better term, a huge amount of psychological scar tissue that an experience like MDMA can help sort of peel back and allow the psychologist to go in and really do some work on their issues. For somebody that's got a lot less scar tissue and is probably perfectly, psychologically healthy, can go through the world, never feels like I need to see a psychologist, I need to see a psychiatrist, it wouldn't even occur to them. Might there still be benefits to be gained for somebody that it is not pathological, but there might still be something there?
Well, I think that the short answer is yes. I mean, I think that everyone has a sense of self that is defended. If you think of the sense of self as a hand, and if you have a lot of scar tissue in your hand, maybe the only thing you can make is a fist. But if the scar tissue is broken up and you regain the capacities of what a human hand can do, you have a lot more things that you can do with your life. So I think that even people who don't have diagnosable PTSD do have an ego. They do have a sense of self. And I think that these tools help people become more flexible. One of the things that I got to experience, and it's such a blessing to experience this, is MAPS has set up a training study where people who have never experienced MDMA personally before, but who are going to be an MDMA therapist, can come in and be given the MDMA protocol with the two therapists in the 8-hour sessions. And so I was able to participate in a study like that.
It seems like you would really be flying blind without it.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense, especially as we consider the possibility that MDMA may go live in a few years on a big scale. One of our concerns is how are we going to make sure that the therapists do a good job with the therapy? It is important, and it is an essential part of the treatment. So we all have blind spots and edges, things that trigger emotional defensiveness. And anybody who's been a therapist a few weeks realizes that being a therapist brings up things. Your client or your patient talks about certain issues. It brings up something that happened to you when you were little, even if you don't have PTSD. So yeah, the short answer is yeah, I think that MDMA psychotherapy, for me, when I got to have that one experience, opened me up to dynamics in myself that I couldn't see without having had that experience. And I've done a lot of work on myself leading up to that. And it showed me things that I had never even realized were in my psyche. So yeah, I think from personal experience, I can say absolutely. I think that would be really helpful, especially for training for psychotherapists.
And just to peel back that a little bit, are you talking about memories you didn't remember as such, or just new ways of thinking of things? Like, what were some of those things that you learned during your session?
I think it was both. It was new ways of understanding things, gaining access to early memories or events that I didn't even know lived in me. This is something that I think is really interesting for your audiences. I mean, I consider myself to be a pretty high-functioning guy. I've had a great career, I've had a great marriage, I've had great friends, and still there can be things that live in you that before you find out that they're there are basically running you. They're operating you. And it's really nice to find out what those things are, because then you have options for actually dealing with these things.
Yeah, it's not just navel gazing. If you actually gain insight into yourself, and then you can make better, at least more informed choices going forward. So beyond the upcoming phase 3 trial, other areas of curiosity, things that you would like to see researched, other front-runner alternative therapies that you're interested in?
A question that's really alive for me right now is what really are the differences between MDMA psychotherapy versus ketamine psychotherapy? And I think that they're very different chemicals, very different neurophysiology, and different outcomes as well. But one of the things that came out of my experience in the phase 2 work and going forward with MAPS with the MDMA work is really seeing this new paradigm that you mentioned before of the intervention, right? The psychotherapy with the facilitation. I don't know if you've been following this ketamine research emergence in the last 10 years. So most of that research is around these ketamine infusions at 0.5 milligram per kilogram over 40 minutes. And going back to Carlos Zarate's work, 2006 at NIMH, and people confirming or not confirming that protocol and, how frequent and how many sessions to do and all that stuff. But people aren't really studying ketamine-facilitated psychotherapy. And that's where I get really interested in this question that everyone's asking of, why doesn't ketamine last? Why doesn't ketamine benefits in studies last longer than a few hours or a few days or a few weeks for people? And I'm over here thinking, well, what about the psychotherapy? I think that's an important body of work that needs to be conducted along the lines of what you said about, well, can we tease out what's the drug effect and what's the psychotherapy effect? If we took what's been done with ketamine over the last 10 years and did that with MDMA, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw similar results from MDMA. Wow, MDMA makes you feel great for a few hours or a few days or a few weeks, but then you're back to square one. We already knew that. And I think we're conducting that experiment with ketamine, which has been cool to see that people get, 75% response rate or remarkable early response rate. But is that really helpful if the person is now coming back for ketamine once every couple weeks or once a month, or now they're just dependent on another phenomenon and they're not really getting to the bottom of the problem again?
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Dr. Will VanDerveer for taking the time for that conversation. Needless to say, exciting times when the FDA is fast-tracking something for phase 3 trials that could really be a breakthrough therapy and something that would have huge effects on quality of life for a lot of people. PTSD is probably one of those things where descriptions don't really do it justice, but on the other hand, even the descriptions do sound categorically awful, the kind of thing that you wouldn't want to see inflicted on anybody, and there's a whole lot of sufferers out there, so we'll keep you posted on progress here. I assume that if MDMA actually does pass the finish line with the FDA, you won't hear it here first. This will be front page news if what's been known as a party drug gets even partially legalized as a prescription drug. And good to see the gates swinging just a little bit wider on the ability to at least effectively research these compounds. And now moving on to some sleep research and why all sleep shirkers are not created equal, let's move on to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So I'm not really much for the genre of horror movies that's kind of the chop 'em up, blood and gore, sadism type horror, but I do get just a little twinge of that, I think, when I hear about some scientific experiments where it's a good thing somebody's doing the experiment, but you're sure glad that you're not the research participant. That's how I felt when reading about the recent Washington State University study onto the effects of sleep deprivation. It is well known that different people fare better or worse than the average when sleep deprived, and there's a certain amount of genetic influence into the ways in which people vary. In this recent study that was published in the journal Scientific Reports, researchers found that one of 3 variants of what's called the DRD2 gene makes people resilient to the effects of sleep deprivation up to 38 hours. At least that's what they tested, the sleep deprivation time in this study. People with this one genetic variation were able to maintain their cognitive flexibility, which is defined as the ability to make appropriate decisions based on changing information, as well as if they were normally slept. In this particular gene, it's known to influence dopamine receptors in an area of the brain known as the striatum, which is understood to be involved with cognitive flexibility. Says the study's lead author, Paul Whitney, our work shows that there are people who are resilient to the effects of sleep deprivation when it comes to cognitive flexibility. Surprisingly, these same people are just as affected as everyone else on other tasks that require different cognitive abilities, such as maintaining focus. This confirms something that we've long suspected, that the effects of sleep deprivation are not general in nature, but rather depend on the specific task and the genes of the person performing the task. So in this study, there were 49 adult participants in the Spokane Sleep Laboratory at Washington State University. All of them got a 10-hour rest period, then 34 of them were randomly selected to go 38 hours without sleep. Then all of them played a computer game where they saw a series of letter pairings on a computer screen. They were told to click the left mouse button in one letter combination and then the right mouse button for any other combination. They did this for a while until everybody got pretty good at it. This is a pretty simple thing to do. Then once everybody was up and running, going at a good speed, the researchers changed the rules of the game, had them look for a different letter combination, and this really screwed up and degraded the performance of most of the sleep-deprived people, but not the performance of the sleep-deprived people with one of the 3 variations of the DRD2 gene. Those lucky folks, although sleep-deprived, performed just as well after the switch as the participants who had gotten a normal amount of sleep. This particular gene influences a person's ability to mentally change direction when given new information. Some people are protected from the effects of sleep deprivation by this variation, but for most of us, sleep loss does something to the brain that simply prevents us from switching gears when circumstances change. This study was funded by the Office of Naval Research, who, as you might imagine, has an interest in identifying which people might be able to perform well in real-world situations where there's quickly changing information and not a lot of sleep to go around. And the Washington State research team is currently applying what they learned to try to develop new ways to help surgeons, police officers, soldiers, and others who deal with the effects of sleep deprivation regularly, says Whitney. Our long-term goal is to be able to train people so that no matter what their genetic composition, they'll be able to recognize and respond appropriately to changing scenarios and be less vulnerable to sleep loss. Of course, the more obvious solution is to just get some more sleep, but in a lot of real-world situations, we don't always have that luxury.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so that was it for episode number 211. Thank you for hanging around with us until the very end, eating into your holiday time. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find the links to everything that we talked about here up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/211. And if you missed last week's episode, in episode number 210, I spoke with Christine Godwin about mind wandering, how and why your mind gets off task, typically a bad thing, but not always. And next week, if I had to guess, and in this case I do, I think we're going to be talking about bilingualism in the brain, also trilingualism, quadrilingualism, however many languages you want to go up to. It's something widely reputed to be very good for our brains. Let's see what the science says. Might get you inspired to be thinking more multilingually in the new year. But I'll see you back here next Friday. That'll be the last episode of 2017. Same time, same podcast. And with that same unflagging, sometimes unreasonable commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, enjoy the holidays, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.